A millionaire CEO walked into his hotel expecting silence and luxury. He found two identical little girls waiting alone, saying only, "She told us to wait somewhere bright and clean." Henry Sutter stepped into the grand marble lobby of his flagship hotel just past 10 o'clock, the echo of his polished shoes swallowed by the plush carpets and quiet hum of nighttime operations. The chandeliers above him glittered with soft light, reflecting off gold fixtures and clean glass, but he barely noticed. His mind was still tangled in the wreckage of the day, another battle with investors who didn't understand vision, the final termination of a longtime executive who had grown too complacent, and a dinner spent alone in the executive lounge, pushing food around his plate while the city pulsed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was a man built for control, for logic, for distance. Every inch of him, his custom beige suit, the sleek leather briefcase in his hand, the way his dark brown hair never quite touched his collar, was curated with intention. His green eyes, sharp and unreadable, rarely lingered on anything that didn't concern numbers or decisions. That night was supposed to be no different. He planned to go straight to the penthouse, review a contract or two, pour a glass of his preferred scotch, and wait for sleep to catch up. But near the entrance, something stopped him. Two little girls were sitting on the deep leather couch by the lobby's tall windows. Identical, no more than 6 years old, with delicate faces and soft light hair that fell past their shoulders. One was alert, her legs pulled up beneath her and her eyes following the movements around her. The other had her head tucked against her sister's side, fast asleep, her small mouth slightly open in dreams. They wore simple clothes, one in a pale pink beige shirt, the other in a white t-shirt and shorts. No jackets, no luggage, no adults nearby. Henry paused. The security guard stationed at the far corner had noticed them too and was speaking quietly into his radio. Possibly abandoned. Could be runaways. Should I call child services? Henry lifted a hand before the guard could act. His voice was calm but final. Don't. I'll handle it. Something in the stillness of the girls, in the quiet way they occupied the space without demanding it, struck him like a key turned in an old lock. He didn't know why he was stopping. He didn't know them. And yet, with every step he took toward them, the air seemed to shift, as if the night had just opened into something else entirely. He approached the girls slowly, careful not to startle them, and crouched down in front of the couch so his eyes were level with theirs. The one who had been watching him, the more alert twin, sat up a little straighter, her small shoulders tense, her arms wrapping protectively around the sleeping girl beside her. The sleeping twin stirred at the sound of Henry's approach, mumbling softly before turning inward and curling even closer against her sister's side. There were no tears. No cries for help. No pleading looks. The girl who was awake simply met Henry's gaze with a steady, cautious calm that seemed far too old for her age. When he gently asked if they were all right, she nodded once and answered with quiet clarity that they were waiting for their mom. She explained that their mother had gone upstairs with someone to talk and hadn't come back. Her voice never trembled, though her fingers clutched the edge of her sister's sleeve as if anchoring herself to something solid. Henry asked what room she had gone to, what name she might have given at check-in, but the girl, Mia, she told him, only shrugged faintly and said she didn't remember everything. They hadn't been told much. They didn't know what floor. They didn't even know the full name their mother had used, only that she had told them one very specific thing: if anything ever happens, go somewhere bright and clean and safe, and wait. I'll come find you. So that's what they had done. They hadn't wandered the streets. They hadn't panicked or run. They had come to a place that fit the description, well lit, spotless, filled with people in uniforms who looked like they were in charge, and they waited. Not just for their mother, it seemed, but for something else, something unspoken. Henry didn't know what to make of it. He didn't know what drew him in so quickly, or why a lump was forming at the base of his throat as he listened to Mia explain, without bitterness or fear, that they were used to waiting. All he knew was that the moment he knelt there beside them, he felt something shift deep inside him, a small crack forming in the solid walls he had spent his entire life building. These girls weren't random. This wasn't coincidence. He didn't understand it yet, couldn't name it, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity: he was already involved, and walking away was no longer an option. Henry didn't return to his penthouse that night. Instead, he stayed in the lobby, making quiet arrangements with the night manager and concierge, his voice low and controlled but with an urgency that no one could miss. He ordered a suite to be prepared for the girls, not just any room, but one on a quiet floor with natural light, 2 beds, stuffed animals, warm blankets, and room service ready to bring whatever food they might ask for, no questions. He instructed the staff to treat them as VIP guests, but not in the way the hotel usually handled high-paying clients. He meant kindness. He meant attention. He meant no alarms, no disruption, and absolutely no calls to outside authorities until he said otherwise. Then he walked the girls up himself, one in each hand, Mia still watchful, Lily, he now knew the sleeping twins' name, barely awake and clinging to his sleeve. He stayed long enough to make sure they were settled, that the television worked, that there were nightlights by the bed and juice in the mini-fridge. When he finally returned to the elevator, he realized with a dull surprise that dawn was breaking. He couldn't sleep. The night had left him raw, full of questions, and the quiet of his penthouse felt colder than usual. By mid-morning, he was back in the manager's office, going through guest records, reviewing check-ins from the past 2 days. It didn't take long to locate the name the girls had mentioned. Hannah Brooks had checked in 2 nights ago. She had given no emergency contact, no credit card of her own, just cash in a handwritten form. Security footage confirmed her arrival with the girls. Then, yesterday evening, it showed her stepping into the elevator with a man, heading to the 12th floor. After that, nothing. She never came down. By late afternoon, Henry had the full report. A housekeeper had entered the room after no response to repeated knocks. Inside, they found Hannah unconscious on the bathroom floor, barely breathing. Paramedics were called. She was alive, but barely, an apparent overdose. The hospital classified her as critical but stable, and she remained unconscious. Henry read every line of the report, every line of her intake form, every note from the paramedics. The name burned in his mind. Hannah Brooks. It wasn't just a name. It was a memory, sharp and unfinished. He remembered her immediately, years ago, another city, another version of himself. They had been involved briefly, intensely. It had been fast, passionate, and ended without explanation. One day she was there, the next day she was gone. He never knew why. He never looked for her. Life had been too busy, too complicated, and Henry didn't make a habit of dwelling on what couldn't be calculated or predicted. And yet now here she was, tangled back into his life in the most impossible way, unconscious in a hospital room, her children waiting in his hotel lobby. But it was more than that. He saw their faces again in his mind, saw how Mia had stared at him with eyes so familiar it hurt. He saw Lily, sleeping against her sister's side, her small hand clutching a corner of her shirt. Those green eyes. That pale hair. That expression. They weren't just any children. They were Hannah's. And possibly, no, likely, his. Henry sat in the security office, alone, long after everyone else had gone back to their routines. The hotel bustled with its usual rhythm, guests checking in and out, staff moving with quiet efficiency, but Henry felt like he was moving through a different world entirely. Everything he thought he knew had been cracked open. Everything about his orderly, protected life now had a question mark placed at the center. He was a man who never made decisions without data, but this was different. This felt like gravity shifting beneath his feet. He didn't know where this path led. But he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that it had already begun. The results came in faster than Henry expected. He had arranged for the DNA tests quietly, using private labs with discretion and speed, something his wealth and position made possible. Still, the few days of waiting stretched endlessly. During that time, he saw the twins daily. He didn't know exactly why he kept returning to their room, only that each time he knocked, something in him steadied. Mia was always the one to answer first, already a little soldier in her own way, assessing his mood before saying anything. Lily remained quieter, more reserved, though her trust began to unfold in slow, tentative gestures, offering him a crayon during one of her long coloring sessions or reaching for his hand when the hallway lights seemed too bright at night. He told himself he was just ensuring their safety. But deep down, he knew he was watching pieces of a truth slide into place. He already felt the answer long before the envelope was opened. When the test results confirmed what instinct had whispered, he stood in silence for a long time. Biological match, 99.99%. There was no doubt. The girls were his daughters. The cold certainty of the report didn't prepare him for the storm of emotions that followed. Disbelief washed over him first, heavy and disorienting. Guilt came next, sharp and unrelenting, as if every decision he'd made in the years since Hannah disappeared had been weighed and found wanting. He had lived a life of control, of clean lines and detached success, while somewhere else, these children had existed, completely unknown to him, their mother struggling alone. And beneath the guilt was something more dangerous, awe. A quiet, powerful feeling that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. He had no idea how to be a father. He had never even considered it. His own childhood had been a textbook of absence and cold expectations. He knew boardrooms and mergers, not lullabies or scraped knees. Yet there he was, standing outside the suite he had given them, fingers tightening on the doorknob, heart racing like it never had before a major deal or shareholder meeting. When he entered, the girls looked up from where they were playing with puzzles on the floor. Mia raised her eyebrows as if expecting news, and Lily crawled onto the bed and tucked her knees to her chest. Henry didn't say anything at first. He just sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at them. Later that night, after the girls had eaten dinner and watched a movie in pajamas far too big for them, Henry stayed longer than usual. Mia fell asleep first, sprawled out across the couch, one hand still clutching a toy giraffe. Lily stayed awake, eyes flicking toward the shadows in the corners of the room. Without saying a word, she got up, padded across the carpet, and wrapped her arms around Henry's waist, pressing her face into his side. He froze for a moment, unfamiliar with the shape and weight of a child's embrace, before slowly lowering one hand to her back. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Something inside him fractured, then reformed, not stronger but softer, real in a way nothing else in his life had ever been. That night, Henry didn't go back to the penthouse. He stayed on the couch in their suite, one twin snuggled into each side, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. A week passed, and with it came the weight of a decision Henry could no longer delay. Hospital social workers and child welfare representatives had finally caught up with the situation, and while they had been respectful, perhaps even intimidated by who he was, they made it clear that an official choice had to be made. Either he would assume full guardianship of Mia and Lily, or the state would begin the process of placing them in foster care. The news was delivered in a calm, procedural tone, but to Henry, it landed like a blunt blow to the chest. The very idea of handing the girls over to strangers, of them being separated, shuffled into a system he had heard too many grim stories about, was intolerable. And yet, the alternative felt just as frightening. Becoming their guardian wasn't just a legal step. It meant becoming their parent in every sense of the word, stepping into a life he had never prepared for and had, until now, never imagined himself worthy of. That morning, after receiving the official notice, he visited the hospital. Hannah had not woken up yet. Her condition had stabilized, and the doctors had moved her out of the ICU, but there was still no guarantee of when, or if, she would regain full consciousness. Henry found himself walking down the long, sterile hallway with a strange sense of dread. He didn't know what he expected to feel when he saw her, but nothing prepared him for the moment he stepped into the room. She looked smaller than he remembered, so still and pale beneath the sheets, her dark hair tangled against the pillow, her hands motionless at her sides. He hadn't seen her in years, but the sight of her now, so quiet and broken, stirred a memory of the woman who had once laughed at his seriousness, who had danced barefoot in his apartment kitchen, who had disappeared without warning and left a blank space in his otherwise tightly ordered life. He stood beside her bed for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, listening to the soft beeping of machines. Her face had changed, thinner, marked by exhaustion, but it was still her. The same Hannah who had once known how to make him feel something before he even knew what to call it. He didn't speak out loud. He didn't know what to say. Apologies felt too small, too late. So he let silence carry the weight. He thought about what she must have gone through. About how desperate things must have become for her to bring their daughters to his hotel and disappear behind a locked door. She hadn't left a note. She hadn't asked for anything. She had simply sent the girls somewhere bright and clean and hoped someone would notice them. And someone had. When he finally turned to leave the room, his hand hesitated on the door. He thought of the twins, of their small voices and sleepy questions, of how Mia always watched him with wary understanding and how Lily had started slipping her hand into his without hesitation. He thought of how they had already begun to build a rhythm around him, imperfect, uncertain, but real. They didn't ask him for the future. They asked if he'd stay. And that question, spoken or unspoken, was the one that held everything now. By the time he returned to the hotel, the decision was no longer something to deliberate. It was already made, somewhere deep inside him, in the places logic couldn't reach. He signed the paperwork the next day. There were interviews, background checks, conversations with caseworkers and lawyers. Every step was a reminder that this was real, that his life was changing. Not just on paper. In truth. He was no longer just a man in a penthouse. He was someone's father, two someones, in fact, and the weight of that was terrifying and holy all at once. The first morning the twins officially lived with Henry began in complete chaos. He had imagined something calmer, maybe a quiet breakfast, the girls getting used to the new space, perhaps even a gentle start to their day. What he got instead was spilled milk soaking into the woven rug of the penthouse dining room, a full-on argument over which spoon was the good one, and Mia storming away from the kitchen because Lily had dared to sit in the chair by the window first. It was a storm of small voices, stubborn feet, and mismatched socks, and Henry stood in the middle of it with a wooden spoon in one hand and a half-toasted slice of bread in the other, entirely out of his depth. He didn't know how to make toast properly. The twins had informed him of this fact with great authority, pointing out that he burned one side and undercooked the other. He had Googled it. He had Googled how to braid hair, too, standing in the bathroom mirror the night before with a comb and one of Lily's dolls, trying to figure out the hand movements. He had never realized how complicated the small routines of children were, the brushing of tiny teeth, the folding of clothes that seemed too small to matter, the careful dance of trying to cut apple slices the exact way they liked without being told what that way was. By mid-morning, things had settled slightly. Mia sulked by the windowsill, insisting that she wanted to sleep there that night, because in movies, people always sit at windows and think about things. Lily, on the other hand, refused to go near the bathroom. When Henry finally coaxed the reason out of her, she admitted in a whisper that she was afraid of the tub because it looked too wide and lonely. So he sat beside her on the tiled floor with a small toy boat and let her pour water into the sink instead, just so she'd brush her teeth. Everything was a negotiation, but one he approached with surprising patience, even when exhausted. He hadn't expected to care this much. He hadn't expected his world to shrink to these little moments, cereal bowls, missing shoes, and the sound of their laughter echoing against the high ceilings. That night, after another small argument over which bedtime story to read and a compromise involving reading 2 chapters of both books, the three of them ended up tangled together on the living room couch. The TV was on, playing a cartoon none of them were really watching, and the lights had been dimmed to a warm glow. Lily curled up under one of Henry's arms, her head nestled against his chest. Mia stretched across his legs, her fingers still clutching the corner of her blanket like a lifeline. He didn't move. He didn't want to. The weight of them grounded him in a way nothing else ever had. Then, out of the dimness, Mia asked, "Are you our home now?" Her voice wasn't demanding, not even uncertain. It was quiet, soft with the weight of hope. Henry didn't answer right away. He looked down at them, both girls half asleep, trusting him without knowing why. He thought of how fragile this all was, how easily he could break it with one wrong move. But then he thought of the hospital, of Hannah lying there silent and still, of the moment he had decided not to walk away. His answer came softly, but it came from somewhere real. "Yes," he said. "I think I am." He didn't know what would come next. He didn't have a plan. But he knew this was the beginning of something he couldn't turn away from, not anymore. It happened just over a month after the girls moved in. Henry had begun to settle into the rhythm of life with Mia and Lily, though nothing about it came naturally. Every day still brought a new challenge, a forgotten lunchbox, a fight over which cartoon was better, an unexpectedly emotional meltdown in the middle of the grocery store. But something had shifted in him. He no longer felt like he was just managing them or helping temporarily. He was beginning to feel like a real part of their world, not just an observer. They laughed louder now. They called him Dad, sometimes, shyly at first, then with increasing ease. He kept a schedule stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, not because he needed it, but because Mia liked making checklists, and Lily liked putting star stickers next to completed tasks. There was warmth in the penthouse now, the kind that couldn't be bought or designed. It came from the clutter, the noise, and the small hands that reached for his in the elevator. When the hospital called to say Hannah had woken up, Henry stopped breathing for a moment. He hadn't visited her in a few weeks, not because he'd forgotten, but because he didn't know what he would say if she opened her eyes. He had rehearsed conversations in his head, accusations, apologies, explanations. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of walking into her room and seeing her awake, sitting propped against a pillow, her face drawn and pale, but conscious. Her eyes found him immediately, and before he could speak, she whispered, "Are they safe?" Her voice was rough and barely there, but the urgency in it made his throat tighten. He nodded, stepping further into the room. "They're safe," he said. "They're with me." She closed her eyes and let out a breath that trembled, and when she opened them again, she didn't cry, not at first. She looked away, toward the window, and her next words came slowly. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could keep going, but I couldn't. Not alone. Not anymore." Then the tears came, silent and steady, carving through the quiet like a confession. Henry sat beside the bed, not knowing if he had the right to comfort her, not knowing what his place was in the story she had lived alone for so long. But she reached for his hand, and he took it, and they sat that way for several minutes without speaking. When she was strong enough to talk more, she didn't ask for custody. She didn't ask for anything. Instead, she looked at him with a clarity that made him feel as though she saw through everything he tried to hide, and she said, "If you mean it, if you really want to be something for them, then don't disappear like you did from my life. Don't vanish when it gets hard." Her words weren't angry, just tired and honest. And Henry didn't flinch. He held her gaze and nodded, slowly, because there was no part of him that wanted to leave now. Not from her, not from them. There was so much they hadn't said. So many questions still between them. Why she'd left without telling him. Why she hadn't reached out. Why she'd waited until desperation drove her back. But those answers could come later. For now, it was enough that she was awake. It was enough that the girls had their mother back, even if she wasn't ready yet to step into her role again. And it was enough that, despite everything broken between them, they were both choosing the same thing now, not themselves, but the girls. Henry left the hospital that evening feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, not certainty, but the start of forgiveness, and maybe something even deeper than that. 1 year later, the hotel lobby looked different, not in the way architects or designers might notice, but in the quieter, subtler changes that marked the passing of time and the presence of life. Near the fireplace, tucked neatly between the velvet armchairs and polished marble side tables, sat a modest play corner with a small shelf of picture books, a bin of blocks, and two tiny armchairs that matched the decor but clearly didn't belong to any adult. A few guests had raised their eyebrows when they first noticed it, expecting the high standards of a luxury hotel to remain untouched by anything as unpredictable as children. But over time, even the most meticulous guests grew used to seeing two little girls racing down the hallways, their laughter echoing faintly behind them, always followed by a watchful staff member or the unmistakable stride of Henry Sutter himself, no longer the untouchable man in a suit but something else entirely. Henry had changed. The transformation hadn't happened all at once, and not without effort. The first few months were filled with uncertainty, as he tried to reconcile the identity he had built over decades with the one he was slowly growing into. He still worked, of course. The company was too large, too demanding to simply walk away from, and he remained its figurehead, respected and sharp as ever. But now, his calendar had entries like school recital and parent-teacher conference, color-coded and non-negotiable. His meetings ended earlier. His mornings started with mismatched socks and spilled juice. He had traded some of his expensive watches for mornings spent braiding hair, sometimes unevenly, sometimes with Lily's tiny hands correcting him. And though his suits remained tailored and his posture as straight as ever, more than one board member had noticed a quiet smile when he pulled a glittery sticker out of his coat pocket, placed there by a daughter who had decided that even important people needed decoration. He still wore control like armor, but it had softened. He no longer saw unpredictability as something to be eliminated. He had learned, often painfully, that life didn't follow quarterly projections, and love didn't arrive on schedule. In the quiet evenings when the girls were asleep and the city lights flickered beyond the glass walls of the penthouse, he sometimes caught himself watching the curve of their faces, identical and yet so different, and wondered how close he had come to never knowing them. It humbled him in a way nothing else had. Hannah had recovered slowly, and though her body healed faster than her spirit, she had made progress. She lived in a small apartment now, not far from the hotel, close enough to visit often but distant enough to keep her space while she continued to rebuild. She attended therapy, took careful steps back into her own life, and never once tried to undermine the home Henry had created for the girls. Instead, she joined it, gradually, in pieces. Some days she came for dinner. Other times she met them at the park or helped with school projects. The twins adjusted to this rhythm instinctively, as children often do, accepting without question that they now had two grown-ups who loved them in different ways, and who no longer had to be enemies to be part of the same story. One sunny afternoon, they were all at the park. The girls ran across the grass, chasing pigeons with shrieks of delight, their laughter carrying across the wind. Hannah sat on a wooden bench, wrapped in a light sweater despite the warmth, a quiet smile on her lips as she watched her daughters play. Henry sat beside her, arms resting on his knees, his suit jacket folded carefully over the bench's back. For a while, they said nothing. The air was filled with the distant hum of the city and the occasional bark of a dog, but between them there was silence, not strained, but reflective. After a while, Henry spoke, his voice low but clear. "Thank you," he said. "For finding them. And for sending them back to me. Even when I didn't deserve it." Hannah didn't look at him immediately. She kept her gaze on the girls, who were now trying to feed bits of cracker to a particularly uninterested pigeon. When she did finally turn to him, there was no bitterness in her eyes, only weariness and something like peace. "You didn't disappear this time," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded, not because it fixed everything, but because it was enough for now. The girls called to them from across the field, arms waving, eyes bright with joy. He stood, brushing off his pants, and offered her his hand. She took it, rising carefully. Together, they walked toward their daughters, the past behind them, not erased but carried, and the future still uncertain but shared. For the first time in a long time, Henry didn't feel afraid of it.